Imagine opening a book and finding this. A flood wipes out nearly every living thing on earth, 2 cities are burned from the sky, and an entire nation's firstborn children die in a single night. Now imagine discovering that, according to the story, the person responsible for all of this is God. Not Satan, not a king, not an invading army, but God. For many people, that's where the conversation ends. But if any human being flooded the world, burned cities, or killed children as punishment for the actions of others, there will be no hesitation in what we'd call them: a murderer. And maybe something even worse, and that's the problem. The Bible contains some of the most disturbing acts of mass death ever described in literature. Yet billions of people worship the very being those acts are attributed to. How do they reconcile that? Are believers ignoring what the text actually says, or is there something much deeper going on beneath the surface of these stories? Because once you start reading the Bible closely, you'll discover something strange. The authors of these texts never seems uncomfortable with these events. They don't apologize for them, they don't soften them. Instead, they present them as acts of justice. And that raises a much harder question, because the question isn't whether God killed people. Clearly, the text is clear about that. We know he did. The real question is whether killing and murder are actually the same thing. To answer that, we need to examine the evidence. And the strongest evidence against God begins with a story almost everyone has heard of.
Noah and the ark.
Noah's ark.
Noah and the ark.
Noah and the ark.
Noah and the ark.
The flood story is so familiar that it's easy to forget what actually happens. We see a lot of children's books showing smiling giraffes, cartoons shows a lot of elephants boarding the ark, but the reality described in Genesis is much darker. The story begins with a diagnosis: humanity has become corrupt and violence is everywhere. Genesis describes a world where every inclination of thought of the human heart was only evil at all times. It's one of the bleakest assessments of human civilization found anywhere in scripture. According to the text, society hadn't simply become flawed, it had become consumed by violence, and God's response is extreme. A flood is sent across the earth and cities disappear. The text states that every living thing outside the ark dies. Men, women, children, entire bloodlines gone. From a factual standpoint, there is very little room for debate. The deaths are directly attributed to God. And this is where the story becomes even more interesting, because Genesis wasn't written in a vacuum. Ancient cultures across Mesopotamia told flood stories long before the Bible existed. The most famous appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh. That flood also involves divine judgment. It also involves a boat. It also involves humanity being wiped out. But there's a major difference. In those older stories, the gods often acted out of annoyance, inconvenience, or internal conflict. The flood in Genesis is framed differently. The author wants readers to understand that the flood isn't random, but rather the flood is an act of justice. Whether that explanation is convincing is another question entirely, because the outcome remains the same. A world dies. And if the flood stood alone, it would already be enough to fuel centuries of debate. But it doesn't stand alone. The Bible records other moments that raises the exact same question, and perhaps none are more infamous than the 2 cities whose name have become synonymous with destruction: Sodom and Gomorrah. Before fire falls from the sky, something unusual happens. God has a conversation, not with a king or a prophet, but with Abraham, and Abraham pushes back, hard. The cities are scheduled for judgment, but Abraham isn't satisfied. What if there are 50 righteous people, he says? God agrees to spare them. Then 45, then 40, 30, 20, 10. The numbers keeps dropping. Each time God agrees. Now this exchange matters because it reveals something many people miss. The destruction isn't portrayed as impulsive. It's preceded by an investigation, by discussion, by delay, by opportunity to spare the city. But eventually the negotiation reaches its limit. And according to the text, even the minimum threshold cannot be found. Then comes the destruction: fire, sulfur, total collapse. The cities are wiped from the landscape. Everyone remaining dies. Most people today associate Sodom with sexual immorality, but when later biblical writers describe Sodom, they often emphasize something broader: violence, pride, abuse, oppression. A society that had become fundamentally hostile to justice. Again, whether that justifies what follows depends on your perspective, but the biblical authors are consistent. The destruction is presented as judgment, not murder, justice, not cruelty. And that's exactly where the tension emerges. Because from the outside, those categories don't always look different. The dead remains dead, the cities remain destroyed, and if someone still isn't convinced by the flood or Sodom, the next story raises an even more difficult challenge. Because this time, children are involved directly. For centuries, the Israelites lived as slaves in Egypt. Generation after generation is born into forced labor. Then a man named Moses appears, and he delivers a simple demand: let my people go. Pharaoh refuses. What follows becomes one of the most famous confrontations in religious history. Water turns to blood, frog swarms the land, darkness covers Egypt. Again and again, warnings are delivered. Again and again, Pharaoh refuses. Then comes the final plague, the one that still troubles readers thousands of years later, the death of the firstborn. The warning is announced in advance, the consequence is clear, and then, according to the text, it happens. In a single night, every Egyptian firstborn dies, from Pharaoh's palace to the lowest servant. The scale is staggering. And unlike the flood or Sodom, this event creates a problem that's difficult to ignore. Many of those who died had no role in Pharaoh's decision. Many were children, which leads directly to one of the strongest arguments critics make against the Bible. If justice is individual, why are entire groups punished? Why should children suffer for the actions of rulers? Why should ordinary people bear the consequences of decisions they don't make? These are modern questions, but they're also ancient questions, and they expose a major difference between how modern societies think and how the biblical world thought. Today, we emphasize individual responsibility. The biblical world frequently viewed nations, families, and communities as interconnected. Individual actions still mattered, but collective identity mattered too. That's why an entire nation could experience consequences together. That explanation helps us understand the logic of the story, but understanding isn't the same as agreement. The discomfort is still there, and maybe it should be, because if we're being honest, the evidence against God is substantial. We're talking about the flood, Sodom, Egypt, 3 separate events, 3 enormous death tolls, 3 stories where the text directly attributes those deaths to God. Which brings us back to the accusation. If a human being did these things, we will call them a murderer immediately. No hesitation, no nuance, no debate. So why does the Bible treat God differently? The answer lies in a single assumption, an assumption so fundamental that everything depends on it, and once we uncover it, the entire argument changes. Not because the deaths disappear, they don't, but because the category itself begins to shift. At this point, the accusation seems straightforward. God causes death repeatedly on a massive scale. And if that's all we knew, the conclusion would appear obvious. But the Bible asks readers to make one assumption before they evaluate any of these events. An assumption so large that many modern readers barely notice it. The assumption is this: God is not one being among many. He's not a superpowered human. He's not a king with greater abilities. He's not simply another moral agent participating inside the universe. According to the Bible, God is the reason the universe exists at all. And that distinction changes everything. Because every accusation we've looked at so far relies on a comparison. A human floods a city, a human burns a town, a human kills children. A human is judged according to the law that exists above them. The law determines whether their actions are legitimate. The law determines whether they're guilty. The law determines whether they're a murderer. But the biblical authors never place God beneath a higher authority. They place him above it. In their view, God isn't subject to a moral system. He's the source of it. And that leads to an uncomfortable implication. If the biblical worldview is true, then God doesn't stand before a judge. He is the judge. For many people, that's where the explanation begins to feel circular, because it sounds like special treatment. God can do these things because he's God. Case closed. But the biblical authors don't stop there. Instead, they spend an enormous amount of time establishing something else. Intent. Because in the Bible, intent matters a lot. Think about the stories we've already covered. The flood doesn't arrive without warning. The text describes generations of growing violence. Sodom isn't destroyed without investigation. Abraham literally negotiates with God beforehand. Egypt doesn't experience judgment after a single refusal. There are repeated warnings, repeated confrontation, repeated opportunities to change course. The pattern appears again and again. Delay, warning, opportunity, judgment. The authors are trying to communicate something very specific. These events aren't portrayed as emotional outbursts. They are portrayed as legal decision. Whether readers accept that framing is another matter, but that's the framing. And it becomes even clearer when we examine one word, a word that sits at the center of this entire debate: murderer. Most people know one version of the commandment.
Thou shalt not kill.
It's among the most famous lines in human history, but the original Hebrew is more specific. The word used is often translated as ratsach, and while many scholars debate precise nuances, the word generally refers to unlawful killing, murder. Not every act that causes death, not warfare, not judicial execution, not accidental killing, but murder. That distinction existed throughout the ancient world. Even modern legal systems recognize it. A police officer can kill, a soldier can kill, a court can sentence someone to death, a murderer can kill. The physical outcome is identical. However, the legal category is different. The distinction rests on authority, legitimacy, and context. And that's exactly where the biblical argument goes. According to scripture, God possesses complete authority over life because life originates from him. Every breath, every heartbeat, every moment, all belongs to him. The book of Job captures this idea bluntly. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Life isn't viewed as independent property. It's viewed as something entrusted, something sustained, something ultimately belonging to its creator. Again, many people reject that premise entirely. But if the premise is accepted, the logic begins to make sense because murder requires illegitimate authority. The biblical narrative never grants that condition to God. In fact, it argues the opposite. And this is where the conversation becomes less about specific events and more about philosophy. Imagine two different universes. In the first universe, morality exists independently of God. There's a higher standard and a cosmic law, and God is subject to it. In that universe, God can potentially violate that law. He can potentially become a murderer. The accusation would remain open, but the Bible describes a different universe, one where God is the source of moral reality itself, one where good and evil derive from his nature, one where there is no higher court, no higher authority, no higher standard. In that framework, God cannot be judged as a murderer because the category itself depends on a lawgiver above the accused, and there is no one above God. That doesn't automatically make his action emotionally satisfying. It doesn't erase the discomfort. It doesn't answer every objection, but it explains why the biblical authors never struggle with the label. They're operating from a completely different starting point, and once you understand that starting point, another piece of the puzzle begins to emerge: knowledge. Because authority alone isn't enough. Justice also requires understanding, and according to the Bible, God's understanding is fundamentally different from ours. Humans see fragments. God sees everything. Every action, every motive, every hidden intention, every consequence, every future outcome. The text consistently portrays God as possessing complete awareness across all of history, past, present, future. If that's true, then God's judgment operates from information humans never have access to, and that creates another divide between divine judgment and human judgment. Human courts makes decisions with incomplete information. Witnesses lie, evidence disappear, mistakes happen. The Bible never presents God as facing those limitations. Instead, it presents him as the only being capable of perfect judgment. Whether someone accepts that claim depends largely on whether they accept the broader worldview behind it. But once again, it explains why Scripture places God in a category separate from everyone else. Not because the deaths didn't happen, but because the role itself is different. God is viewed as the creator, the sustainer of life, and ultimately the judge. The same roles appear repeatedly from Genesis to Revelation, and that's where the debate becomes much larger than Noah, much larger than Sodom, much larger than Egypt. Because now we're no longer asking whether God killed people, we're asking whether God has the right to judge humanity at all. And that's a question that reaches far beyond ancient history. It reaches directly into the present. At the beginning of this video, we asked a simple question: is God a murderer? By now, the answer depends almost entirely on where you start. If God is simply a powerful being, then the accusation carries enormous force. The evidence is difficult to ignore. The flood, Sodom and Gomorrah, the firstborn of Egypt. These stories involves real deaths described in direct language and attributed directly to God. No serious reading of the Bible can avoid that. The text never attempts to hide it. But if the Bible's claims about God are true, the question changes. Because the biblical authors aren't describing a powerful being inside the universe. They're describing the source of the universe itself, the creator of life, the sustainer of life, the final judge of life. And from that perspective, the category of murderer begins to break down. Not because the deaths disappear or suffering disappear. They remain exactly where they've always been. The flood is still the flood. Sodom is still destroyed. Egypt still mourns its dead. The emotional weight is still there. What changes is the framework used to interpret those events, and that's why this debate has lasted for thousands of years. Because beneath the surface, people often argue about two different questions. One question is visible, the other sits underneath it. The visible question is, did God kill people? The Bible's answer is yes. The deeper question, however, is what gives anyone the right to judge whether those killings were justified? And that's where the conversation becomes much more complicated, because every moral judgment rests on a standard. When we call something evil, we're measuring it against something. When we call something unjust, we're appealing to something. When we call someone a murderer, we're assuming a definition that existed before the accusation is ever made. The disagreement begins when people ask where the standard comes from. Some argue morality exists independently of God. Others argue morality originates with God. And whichever answer a person chooses largely determines how they interpret the story we've discussed so far. That's why these Asian narrative continues to provoke such strong reactions. They're not simply stories about judgment, they're stories about authority, about morality, about who gets to define justice, and whether ultimate justice exists at all. Interestingly, the Bible doesn't spend much time defending God's right to judge. It assumes it. The authors write as though that authority is already established, as though the creator of life naturally possesses authority over life, as though judgment is an extension of creation itself. Modern readers often push back against that assumption. And understandably so. Most people instinctively distrust concentrated power. History gives us plenty of reason to. Human beings abuse authority constantly. Kings abuse authority, governments abuse authority, religious leaders abuse authority, entire civilization have abused authority. But the biblical argument rests on a distinction. Every human authority is limited. Every ruler is flawed. Every government is incomplete. Every judge is capable of error. God, according to the text, is none of these things. The entire argument depends on that claim. Remove it and the accusation gains strength. Accept it and the accusation changes shape entirely. Which is why the question, is God a murderer, ultimately leads somewhere unexpected. It leads to a question about God's identity. Because before someone can decide whether God is guilty, they have to decide who God is. And that's where the conversation leaves ancient floods and burning cities behind. It becomes personal. Because if God is merely a powerful being, then his actions can be evaluated the same way we evaluate everyone else's. But if God is what scriptures claim he is, then every person lives within a reality they did not create, under a moral order they did not establish, moving toward a judgment they cannot avoid. The idea has unsettled people for thousands of years. It unsettles people today. And maybe that's part of the reason why these stories still endure. Not because they're comfortable, but because they're challenging. They force readers to confront questions that most of us rarely stop to consider. Questions about justice, about morality, questions about authority and accountability. And perhaps the most important question of all, who gets to decide what is good? If you're looking for a simple answer, the Bible doesn't give one. It records the deaths, it attributes them to God, and then it asks the reader to view those same events through a completely different lens than they would apply to someone else. That's the tension. Because the moment God becomes subject to the same moral standards as everyone else, the accusation feels obvious. But the moment God stands above those standards as their source, the accusation starts to break apart. And whether you find that convincing depends on a much deeper question. Before you can decide whether God is a murderer, you have to decide what God actually is. Is he a powerful being, a moral agent, a cosmic ruler, or the very source of morality itself? Because your answer to that question determines the answer to the first one. And that's why the debate never really ends. The flood ends, Sodom ends, Egypt ends, but the question remains, waiting for every generation to answer it